In summer 1942, the Allies decided to mount major offensives in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands with the objectives of defending sea lines to Australia, and eventually attacking the major Japanese base at Rabaul on New Britain. The Guadalcanal operation was under the command of Robert L. Gormley, reporting to Chester W. Nimitz, while the Japanese defense consisted of the combined fleet under Isoroku Yamamoto and the 17th Army under Harukishi Haikude. On 7 August 1942, Allied forces, predominantly U.S. Marines, landed on Guadalcanal, Chalagi, and Florida Island in the southern Solomon Islands. The Japanese defenders, who had occupied the islands since May 1942, offered little initial resistance, but the capture of Guadalcanal soon turned into a lengthy campaign as both sides added reinforcements. The Allies captured and completed Henderson Field on Guadalcanal and established a defense perimeter. The Japanese made several attempts to retake the airfield, including in mid-September and in late October. The campaign also involved major naval battles, including the battles of Savo Island, the Eastern Solomons, Cape Esperance, and the Santa Cruz Islands, culminating in a decisive Allied victory at the naval Battle of Guadalcanal in mid-November. Further engagements took place at the Battle of Tassafaronga and Battle of Renal Island. In December, the Japanese decided to abandon Guadalcanal to focus on the defense of the other Solomon Islands, and evacuated their last forces by 9 February 1943. The campaign followed the successful Allied defensive actions at the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway in May and June 1942. Along with the battles at Milne Bay and Buna, Gona on New Guinea, the Guadalcanal Campaign marked the Allies' transition from defensive operations to offensive ones, and effectively allowed them to seize the strategic initiative in the Pacific theater from the Japanese. The campaign was followed by other major Allied offensives in the Pacific, most notably the Solomon Islands Campaign, New Guinea Campaign, the Gilbert and Marshall Islands Campaign, the Mariana and Palau Islands Campaign, the Philippines Campaign of 1944 to 1945, and the Volcano and Ryukyu Islands Campaign prior to the surrender of Japan in August 1945. Background: Strategic considerations. Japanese control of the Western Pacific area between May and August 1942. Guadalcanal is located in the lower right center of the map. On 7 December 1941, Japanese forces attacked the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack killed almost 2,500 people and crippled much of the U.S. battleship fleet, precipitating formal declarations of war between the two nations the next day. The initial goals of the Japanese leadership were to neutralize the U.S. Navy, seize territories rich in natural resources, and establish strategic military bases with which to defend Japan's empire in the Pacific Ocean and Asia. Initially, Japanese forces captured the Philippines, Thailand, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, Wake Island, Gilbert Islands, New Britain, and Guam. The U.S. was joined in the war against Japan by several of the Allied powers, including the British Empire and the Dutch government in exile, both of which had also been attacked by Japan. 12. The Japanese made 2 attempts to continue their offensive and extend their outer defensive perimeter in the South and Central Pacific to a point at which they could threaten Australia, Hawaii, and the U.S. West Coast. The first offensive was thwarted in the naval Battle of the Coral Sea, which was a tactical stalemate but a strategic Allied victory in retrospect. It was the Allies' first major victory against the Japanese, and significantly reduced the offensive capability of Japan's carrier forces. However, the battle did not temper Japan's audacious offensive military posture for several crucial months, with Japanese forces attempting a failed attack on Port Moresby over the Kokoda Track. The second major Japanese offensive was stopped at the Battle of Midway. Both sides suffered significant losses in carrier aircraft and aircrew during these engagements. Crucially, while the Americans were able to reconstitute their naval air strength in relatively short order, the Japanese ultimately proved unable to do so. 13. These strategic victories allowed the Allies to transition to a more offensive stance in the Pacific theater and attempt to seize the strategic initiative from Japan. 14. The Allies chose the Solomon Islands, a protectorate of the United Kingdom, specifically the southern islands of Guadalcanal, Chalagi, and Florida Island, as their first target, designated Task 1 codename Pestilence, with the initial objectives occupying the Santa Cruz Islands codename Huddle, Chalagi codename Watchtower, and adjacent positions. 17 Guadalcanal codename Cactus, which eventually became the focus of the operation, was not even mentioned in the early directive. It only later took on the operation name Watchtower. 15 Chalagi, although small, had a large natural harbor that was ideal for a floatplane base. Florida Island also had to be taken as it dominated Chalagi. Guadalcanal, much larger than the other 2 islands and located to the south across the soon-to-be-named Iron Bottom Sound, was added when it was discovered the Japanese were constructing an airbase there. 18. The Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, had occupied Chalagi in May 1942 and had constructed a seaplane base nearby. Allied concern grew when, in early July, the IJN began constructing a large airfield at Lunga Point on nearby Guadalcanal. From such a base, Japanese long-range bombers could threaten the sea lines of communication and maritime trade and transportation routes from the west coast of the Americas to the populous east coast of Australia. By August, the Japanese had about 900 naval troops on Chalagi and nearby islands, and 2,800 personnel, including 2,200 Korean forced laborers and trustees, as well as Japanese construction specialists on Guadalcanal. These bases were meant to protect Japan's major naval base at Rabaul, threat Allied supply and communication lines, and establish a staging area for a planned offensive against Fiji, New Caledonia, and Samoa. Operation FS. The Japanese planned to deploy 45 fighters and 60 bombers to Guadalcanal. In the overall strategy for 1942, these aircraft would provide ground-based air cover for Japanese naval forces advancing farther into the South Pacific. 19. The Allied plan to invade the Southern Solomons was conceived by U.S. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief, United States Fleet. He proposed the offensive in order to deny the use of the islands to the Japanese as bases from which the supply routes between the United States and Australia could be threatened, and to use them as starting points for further Allied offensives in the South Pacific. With U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's tacit consent, King also advocated for an invasion of Guadalcanal. Due to the Roosevelt administration's support for Great Britain's proposal that priority be given to defeating Germany before Japan, Allied commanders in Pacific Theater had to compete for personnel and resources with the European theater. 20. An early obstacle was the desire of both the U.S. Army and the Roosevelt administration to initiate offensive action in Europe prior to a large-scale operation in the Pacific. 21. In addition, it was initially unclear who would command the campaign. Chalagi lay in the area under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, whereas the Santa Cruz Islands lay in Admiral Chester W. Nimitz's Pacific Ocean area, which would also supply almost all Allied offensive forces that would be staged, supplied, and covered from that area. 22. Both problems were overcome, and the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, General George C. Marshall, gave the operation his full support. Despite MacArthur's command being unable to directly assist in the operation, and the U.S. Navy taking full operational responsibility. 23-24. As a result, and in order to preserve the unity of command, the boundary between MacArthur's Southwest Pacific area and Nimitz's Pacific Ocean area was shifted 60 miles 97 km to 360 miles 580 km to the west. Effective from 1 August 1942, 22. Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief William D. Leahy established two goals for 1942-1943. First, that Guadalcanal would be taken, in conjunction with an Allied offensive in New Guinea under MacArthur. And second, that the Admiralty Islands and Bismarck Archipelago, including the major Japanese base at Rabaul, would be captured as well. The directive held that the eventual goal was the American reconquest of the Philippines, from which American forces had been evicted in early 1942. 25. The U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff created the South Pacific Theater, with Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley taking command on 19 June, to direct the offensive in the Solomons. Nimitz, based at Pearl Harbor, was designated as overall Allied Commander-in-Chief for Allied forces in the Pacific. 26. Task Force. Further information: Battle of Guadalcanal Order of Battle and Guadalcanal Naval Order of Battle. The airfield at Lunga Point on Guadalcanal under construction by Japanese and conscripted Korean laborers in July 1942. In preparation for the offensive in the Pacific in May 1942, U.S. Marine Major General Alexander Vandegrift was ordered to move his 1st Marine Division from the United States to New Zealand. Other Allied land, naval and air units were sent to establish or reinforce bases in Fiji, Samoa, New Hebrides and New Caledonia. 27. The island of Espiritu Santo in the New Hebrides was selected as the headquarters and primary staging ground for the offensive, codenamed Operation Watchtower, with the commencement date set for 7 August. At first, only the seizure of Chalagi and the Santa Cruz Islands was planned, omitting a landing on Guadalcanal. After Allied reconnaissance discovered Japanese airfield construction efforts on Guadalcanal, its capture was added to the plan, and planned landings on the Santa Cruz Islands were eventually abandoned. 28. The Japanese were aware via signals intelligence of the large-scale movement of Allied forces in the South Pacific area, but concluded that the Allies were reinforcing either Australia or Port Moresby on the southern coast of New Guinea. 29. The Watchtower Force, numbering 75 warships and transports, including vessels from the US and Australia, assembled near Fiji on 26 July and conducted a single rehearsal landing prior to leaving for Guadalcanal on 31 July. The commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force was U.S. Vice Admiral Frank Fletcher, commander of Task Force 16, whose flag was on the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga. Commanding the amphibious forces was U.S. Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner. Vandegrift led the 16,000 Allied, primarily U.S. Marine, infantry earmarked for the amphibious landings. The troops sent to Guadalcanal were fresh from military training, armed with legacy bolt-action M1903 Springfield rifles and a meager 10-day supply of ammunition. Because of the need to get the troops into battle quickly, the Allied planners had reduced their supplies from 90 days to only 60. The men of the 1st Marine Division began referring to the coming battle as Operation Shoestring. 32. Events. Landings. Further information: Battle of Chalagi and Gavutu-Tanamboga. Routes of Allied amphibious forces for landings on Guadalcanal and Chalagi, 7 August 1942. Bad weather allowed the Allied Expeditionary Force to arrive unseen by the Japanese on the night of 6 August and morning of 7 August, taking the defenders by surprise. This is occasionally referred to the midnight raid on Guadalcanal. 33. A Japanese patrol aircraft from Chalagi had searched the general area that the Allied invasion fleet was moving through, but was unable to spot the Allied fleet due to severe storms and heavy clouds. 34. The landing force split into two groups, with one group assaulting Guadalcanal and the other Chalagi, Florida and other nearby islands. 35. Allied warships bombarded the invasion beaches. While U.S. carrier aircraft bombed Japanese positions on the target islands and destroyed 15 Japanese seaplanes at their base near Chalagi. 36. Chalagi and two nearby small islands, Gavutu and Tanambogo, were assaulted by 3,000 U.S. Marines under the command of Brigadier General William Rupertus. 37. The 886 IJN personnel manning the naval and seaplane bases on the three islands fiercely resisted the Marine landings. 38. With some difficulty, the Marines secured all three islands. Chalagi on 8 August and Gavutu and Tanambogo by 9 August. 39. The Japanese defenders were killed almost to the last man. 40. And the Marines suffered 248 casualties. 41. U.S. Marines debark from LCP LS onto Guadalcanal on 7 August 1942. In contrast to Chalagi, Gavutu and Tanambogo, the landings on Guadalcanal encountered much less resistance. At 09:10 on 7 August, Vandegrift and 11,000 U.S. Marines came ashore on Guadalcanal between Coley Point and Lunga Point. Advancing towards Lunga Point, they encountered scant Japanese resistance and secured the airfield by 16:00 on 8 August. The Japanese naval construction units and combat troops, under the command of Captain Kanny Monzon, had panicked after coming under naval bombardment and aerial bombing, and had abandoned the airfield and fled about 3 miles 5 km west to the Matnica River and Point Cruz area. Japanese troops left behind food, supplies, intact construction equipment and vehicles, and 13 dead at the airfield and surrounding area. 42. During the landing operations on 7 and 8 August, Rabaul-based Japanese naval aircraft under the command of Yamada Sadayoshi attacked the Allied amphibious forces several times, setting on fire the transport USS George F. Elliott, which sank 2 days later, and heavily damaging the destroyer USS Jarvis. 43. Over the course of 2 days of air attacks, Japanese air units lost 36 aircraft, while the U.S. lost 19, including 14 carrier aircraft, both in combat and to accidents. 44. After these aerial clashes, Fletcher became concerned about the unexpectedly high losses to his carrier fighter aircraft strength, anxious about the threat to his carriers from further Japanese air attacks, and worried about his ship's remaining fuel supply. Fletcher withdrew from the Solomon Islands area with his carrier task force on the evening of 8 August. 45. In response to the loss of carrier-based air cover, Turner decided to withdraw his ships from Guadalcanal, even though less than half of the supplies and heavy equipment needed by the troops ashore had been unloaded. 46. Turner planned to unload as many supplies as possible on Guadalcanal and Chalagi throughout the night of 8 August, and then depart with his ships early on 9 August. 47. Battle of Savo Island. Main article: Battle of Savo Island. As the transports continued to unload on the night of 8-9 August, two groups of screening Allied cruisers and destroyers, under the command of British Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley, were surprised and defeated by a Japanese force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer from the 8th Fleet based at Rabaul and Kavieng, commanded by Japanese Vice Admiral Junichi Mikawa. The 8th Fleet had been sighted at least 5 times over the course of the previous days, both by Allied submarines and aerial reconnaissance, but a combination of misidentification of ships and the Allied leadership's dismissal of Japanese night fighting capability contributed to an air of complacence and ignorance among the Allied surface fleet that proved disastrous. Japanese submarine activity and air attack continued to be the main source of concern to Turner and his staff, not the threat of Japanese surface action. Japanese cruiser Yubari shines searchlights towards the northern force during the night battle around Savo Island on 9 August 1942. In the course of this action, 4 Allied cruisers were sunk and 1 was heavily damaged with no Japanese ships lost, and the transport fleet was left exposed to further attack. As a result, during the Battle of Savo Island on the night of 9 August, Mikawa's force was able to surprise and sink 1 Australian and 3 American cruisers, as well as damage another American cruiser and 2 destroyers. The Japanese suffered only moderate damage to 1 cruiser, 48. Despite this success, Mikawa was unaware that Fletcher was preparing to withdraw with the U.S. aircraft carriers, and immediately retired to Rabaul without attempting to attack the now defenseless Allied transports, fearing daytime air attacks on his vessels once the cover of darkness had been lost. Bereft of his carrier air cover and concerned about Japanese submarine and surface attacks against his degraded fleet, Turner withdrew his badly mauled naval forces from the area on the evening of 9 August. This left the Marines ashore under strength, as some transports in the Allied fleet had retreated without disembarking all of their troops, and without much of their heavy equipment and provisions. Mikawa's decision not to attempt to destroy the Allied transport ships when he had the opportunity proved to be a crucial strategic mistake. 49. Initial ground operations. Initial U.S. Marine defenses around the airstrip at Lunga Point, Guadalcanal, 12 August 1942. Map showing the U.S. Marine attacks west of the Matanika River on 19 August. The 11,000 Marines on Guadalcanal initially concentrated on forming a loose defensive perimeter centered around Lunga Point and the airfield, moving what supplies had been brought ashore within the perimeter, and completing the construction of the airfield. Over 4 days of intense effort, the supplies were moved from the landing beaches to dispersed dumps within the defensive perimeter. Work began on the airfield immediately, mainly using captured Japanese equipment. On 12 August, the airfield was named Henderson Field after Lofton R. Henderson, a Marine aviator who was killed during the Battle of Midway. By 18 August, the airfield was ready for operation. 55 days' worth of food had been landed from the transports, which along with captured Japanese provisions gave the Marines a total of 14 days' supply of food. 51. To conserve supplies, the troops were limited to 2 meals per day. 52. Allied troops suffered from a severe strain of dysentery soon after the landings, with 1 in 5 Marines afflicted by mid-August. 53. Although some of the Korean construction workers surrendered to the Marines, most of the remaining Japanese and Korean personnel gathered just west of the Lunga perimeter on the west bank of the Matanika River and subsisted mainly on coconuts. A Japanese naval outpost was also located at Taivu Point, about 35 kilometers 22 mi east of the Lunga perimeter. On 8 August, a Japanese destroyer from Rabaul delivered 113 naval reinforcement troops to the Matanika position. 54. Goji Patrol. On the evening of 12 August, a 25-man U.S. Marine patrol, led by Division D2 Lieutenant Colonel Frank Goethe, and primarily consisting of intelligence personnel, landed by boat west of the U.S. Marine Lunga perimeter, east of Point Cruz and west of the Japanese perimeter at Matanika River, on a reconnaissance mission with a secondary objective of contacting a group of Japanese troops that U.S. forces believed might be willing to surrender. Soon after the patrol landed, a nearby platoon of Japanese naval troops attacked it and almost completely wiped it out. 55. In response, on 19 August, Vandegrift sent 3 companies of the U.S. 5th Marine Regiment to attack the Japanese troop concentration west of the Matanika. One company attacked across the sandbar at the mouth of the Matanika River, while another crossed the river 1,000 meters, 1,100 wide, inland and attacked the Japanese forces located in Matanika village. The third landed by boat further west and attacked Kokumbuna village. After briefly occupying the 2 villages, the 3 Marine companies returned to the Lunga perimeter, having killed about 65 Japanese soldiers while losing 4 Marines. This action, sometimes referred to as the First Battle of the Matanikau, was the first of several major actions around the Matanikau River during the campaign, 56. On 20 August, the escort carrier USS Long Island delivered a squadron of 19 Grumman F-4F Wildcats and a squadron of 12 Douglas SBD Dauntlesses to Henderson Field. The airfield's rudimentary nature meant that carrier aircraft, designed for rough landings on flight decks at sea, were more suited for use on Henderson Field than ground-based planes. The aircraft based at Henderson became known as the Cactus Air Force, after the Allied codename for Guadalcanal Cactus. The Marine fighters went into action the next day, which also saw the first of what would become almost daily Japanese bomber air raids on the airfield. On 22 August 5 U.S. Army Bell P-400 Airacobras and their pilots arrived at Henderson Field, 57. Battle of the Tenaru. Main article: Battle of the Tenaru. Dead Japanese soldiers on the sandbar at the mouth of Alligator Creek, Guadalcanal after the Battle of the Tenaru. In response to the Allied landings, the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters assigned the task of retaking Guadalcanal to the Imperial Japanese Armies, IJA 17th Army, a corps-sized command based at Rabaul under the command of Lieutenant General Harukichi Haikudake. The army was to be supported by Japanese naval units, including the combined fleet under the command of Isoroku Yamamoto, which was headquartered at Truk. The 17th Army, at that time heavily involved in the Japanese campaign in New Guinea, had only a few units available to allocate to Guadalcanal. Of these, the 35th Infantry Brigade under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi was at Palau, the 4th Yaba Infantry Regiment under Major General Yumio Nasu was in the Philippines, and the 28th Ikiki Infantry Regiment under the command of Colonel Keanu Ikiki was berthed on transport ships near Guam. These units began to move towards Guadalcanal via Truk and Rabaul immediately, but Ikiki's regiment, being the closest, arrived in the area first. A first element of Ikiki's unit, consisting of about 917 soldiers, was landed by IJN destroyers at Taivu Point, east of the Lunga perimeter, after midnight on 19 August, then conducted a 9-mile 14 km night march west toward the marine perimeter, 58-59. Underestimating the strength of Allied forces on Guadalcanal, Ikiki's unit conducted a nighttime frontal assault on marine positions at Alligator Creek, often called the Ilu River on U.S. marine maps, on the east side of the Lunga perimeter in the early morning hours of 21 August. Jacob Vuza, a Solomon Islands coastwatcher scout, warned the Americans of the impending attack minutes before it started. The attack was defeated with heavy losses to the Japanese. After daybreak, the Marine units counterattacked Ikiki's surviving troops, killing many more of them. The dead included Ikiki. It has been reported that he died by seppuku after realizing the magnitude of his defeat. 60, in total, 789 of the original 917 members of the Ikiki Regiment's first element were killed in the battle. About 30 survived the battle and joined Ikiki's rear guard of about 100, and these 128 Japanese returned to Taivu Point, notified 17th Army headquarters of their defeat and awaited further reinforcements and orders from Rabaul. 61. Battle of the Eastern Solomons. Main article: Battle of the Eastern Solomons. The carrier USS Enterprise under aerial attack during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. As the Tenaru battle was ending, more Japanese reinforcements were already on their way to Guadalcanal. Yamamoto had organized an extremely powerful naval expeditionary force, with the goal of destroying any American fleet units in the Solomons and subsequently eliminating Allied ground forces at Henderson Field. This force sortied from Truk on 23 August. Several other IJN units carrying reinforcements and supplies, and ships tasked with naval bombardment of the island, sortied from both Truk and Rabaul. 62 3 slow transport ships departed from Truk on 16 August. Carrying the remaining 1,400 soldiers from Ikiki's 28th Infantry Regiment plus 500 naval marines from the 5th Yokosuka Special Naval Landing Force. 63, the transports were guarded by 13 warships commanded by Japanese Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka, who planned to land the troops on Guadalcanal on 24 August. 64, to cover the landing of these troops and provide support for the operation to retake Henderson Field from Allied forces, Yamamoto directed Chuichi Nagumo to sortie with a carrier force from Truk on 21 August and sail toward the southern Solomon Islands. Nagumo's force included 3 carriers and 30 other warships. 65, Yamamoto would send the light carrier Ryujo ahead of the rest of the Japanese fleet to act as bait to draw the American aircraft into combat. The aircraft from the 2 fleet carriers would then attack the American fleet while it lacked air cover. 62. Simultaneously, the U.S. carrier task force under Fletcher approached Guadalcanal to counter the Japanese offensive efforts. 66. On 24 August, the two carrier forces located and launched strikes against each other. The Japanese had two fleet carriers, the Shikaku and Zuikaku, as well as the light carrier Ryujo, 62, with a total of 177 carrier-based aircraft. The American forces had two carriers, the Saratoga and Enterprise, and their 176 aircraft. The Japanese light carrier Ryujo, offered as bait to Allied naval aircraft, was hit by several 1,000-pound 450 kg bombs and an aerial torpedo. She was abandoned by her crew and sank that night. 62. The two Japanese fleet carriers were not attacked, but Japanese aircraft successfully attacked Enterprise, badly damaging her flight deck. Both fleets subsequently retreated from the area. The Japanese lost the Ryujo, along with dozens of carrier aircraft and most of their aircrew. The Americans lost a handful of planes and suffered damage to Enterprise, requiring 2 months to repair in Hawaii. 67. Unable to safely land on Enterprise's ruined flight deck, many of her remaining aircraft flew to Guadalcanal and reinforced the beleaguered American air units at Henderson Field. Concurrently to the carrier air battle on 25 August, Tanaka's convoy headed by the flagship Jinsu was attacked near Teivu Point 62 by Cactus Air Force aircraft based at Henderson Field. After suffering heavy damage during the battle, including the sinking of one of the transports, the convoy was forced to divert to the Shortland Islands in the Northern Solomons in order to transfer the surviving troops to destroyers for later delivery to Guadalcanal. 68. A Japanese transport was sunk, and the older destroyer Matsuki was so badly damaged that she had to be scuttled. Several other Japanese warships were damaged, including Tanaka's flagship Jinsu. At this point, Tanaka withdrew and rescheduled the supply run for the night of 28 August to be carried out by the remaining destroyers. Japanese air raids against the Allied positions on Guadalcanal continued largely unabated during this time. On 25 August, the American carrier Wasp, after refueling, positioned herself east of Guadalcanal, expecting Japanese movement to the area. No Japanese forces made any movement towards the area, however, and the Wasp was left idle. 62. The Americans had won a modest tactical victory with the destruction of the Ryujo, destroying some 75 Japanese aircraft while losing 25 of their own. The forced withdrawal of Tanaka's troop convoy also bought valuable breathing room for the embattled Allied troops on Guadalcanal. While the Enterprise was taken out of action for repair for several months, she was able to return to sea later in the campaign. The temporary loss of Enterprise was offset by the timely arrival of the carrier Hornet. Additionally, the reinforcement of Henderson Field by Enterprise's orphaned carrier aircraft bolstered ground-based Allied air strength on the island, while ground-based Japanese pilots based at Rabaul were forced to undertake a grueling day-long round-trip flight in order to make their attacks. These factors combined to render daylight supply runs to Guadalcanal impossible for the Japanese. Only weeks before this, the Japanese had total control of the sea in the region. Now they were forced to make supply runs only under the cover of darkness. 62. Japanese naval commanders began to recognize the reality that their ships could not safely operate in the Solomons in the daytime without first suppressing Allied air power at Henderson Field. Transport Division 12. For 6 weeks, from early August to the end of September, the U.S. Navy largely avoided the waters off Chalagi and Guadalcanal, and was ordered not to resupply the Marines or provide escort duty for slow transport ships, as American naval commanders feared a repeat of the disastrous defeat at Savo Island suffered by Australian and American surface vessels on 9 August.